The snow had come 3 weeks early and taken the north wall of the barn with it. Calvin Pruitt stood in the wreckage on a Tuesday morning in November, looking at the gap where the wall had been, at the gray Kansas sky pouring through where timber used to stand, and he did not move for a long time. 6 horses, 11 head of cattle, a milk cow with a calf that was already thin from a hard summer. He did not have the money to hire Aldercott's crew from Delphos, who were the only men within 40 miles, capable of raising a framed wall before the next storm came through. He did not have the money because the bank in Salina had sent a notice in October that he had not been able to fully read, though he had tried 4 times, moving his finger under the lines until the shame of it made him fold the letter and put it in the tin box under the bed alongside the 2 earlier ones. His son Emmett came out of the house and stood beside him. The boy was 8 years old and had his mother's way of not asking questions he already knew the answer to. He stood in his coat with his hands in his pockets and regarded the gap in the barn the same way his father did, as something that had to be assessed before it could be grieved. A wagon came up the road. Calvin heard it before he saw it, the particular drag of iron-banded wheels on frozen ground, lighter than a loaded freight rig, heavier than a pleasure conveyance. He turned. The woman driving was perhaps 30. She had a small girl beside her on the bench, not more than 2 years old, bundled in a quilt that had been cut down to fit. Behind the bench, tucked into a blanket nest between a carpet bag and a heavy wooden crate, sat a boy who appeared to be 12 or 13. The woman's coat was not adequate for Kansas in November. She had a wool scarf wound over it twice, and that was all. She stopped the horse at his fence line and studied the barn. Then she studied Calvin. "Give my family bread. I'll rebuild your barn." Calvin Pruitt considered this woman on the seat of a near-empty wagon, in a coat too thin for the month, with 2 children and a carpet bag between them all, and he did not know what to make of what she had just said. His son Emmett stood still beside him, watching her with no expression at all, which was the expression Emmett used when he was paying close attention. He took a step toward the fence. "Ma'am, I have tools." She tilted her head toward the crate in the wagon bed. "My husband was a carpenter for 11 years. I worked beside him for 6 of them. I can frame and raise and sheath, and I know how to cut the mortise and tenon joints on the corner posts so the wall holds through wind and wet and does not move." She returned her gaze to the barn. "That north wall came down because the original posts were sistered wrong. I can see it from here." He looked at the barn and then back at her. "You drove up from where?" "Abilene. We had a house there until the spring." She did not explain further. "I am not asking for wages. I am asking for flour and salt and a dry roof over my children while I work. My brother," she glanced back at the boy in the wagon, "can carry materials and manage the team. The baby does not take up space." Emmett looked up at his father. Calvin said nothing for a moment. "It is a 2-week job, maybe 3. She looked at him steadily. "It is a 10-day job if the lumber is already cut and I do not have to mill it myself." "Is it cut?" He had 200 board feet of green lumber under tarpaulin by the south fence, bought in September for a repair he had never gotten to. He told her so. Then 10 days. She settled the reins in her hands. "Give us bread and a place to sleep and keep us warm, and I will give you a wall that stands for 40 years. This was not a negotiation he had expected to have that morning. He looked at his son once more. Emmett had not moved, and his eyes had not left the woman's face. Calvin took a step back from the fence. "Come down out of that wagon." Her name was Nora Bain. The boy was her brother Teddy, 13, and the small girl was her daughter Jessamine, called Jess, who was 2 years and 4 months old and had her mother's dark eyes and a studied indifference to strangers. They came inside, and Nora stood in Calvin's kitchen and studied the stove the way a person looks at a thing they have been thinking about for a long time, confirming it was real and still working. Calvin had bread from 2 days before. He had salt pork and dried beans and 3 jars of last summer's corn put up in August. He set it all on the table without being asked, and Nora fed her children before she touched anything herself, which Calvin noticed and did not remark on. They slept that night in the room off the kitchen that had been a storage room since Calvin's wife Ellen had died 18 months before. He had cleared it of nothing. Nora cleared it herself in the last hour before dark, moving flour sacks in a broken churn and 4 crates of odds that should have been sorted long ago, handling all of it with the quiet economy of someone who had moved many things in her life and considered none of it a remarkable imposition. In the morning, Calvin came downstairs and found Emmett already at the table. The boy was setting out 4 bowls instead of 2. He had pulled a low wooden stool up to the side of his chair and placed the smallest bowl on it at a height a 2-year-old could reach without assistance. He arranged spoons alongside the bowls with the same care he gave everything, and he did not look up when his father came in. Calvin set the coffee on. He said nothing about the bowls. Nora was on the barn site by first light the following morning. She walked the full perimeter of the fallen wall, then crouched and ran her bare hand along the broken grain of the post stumps, turning each piece over to examine the underside, pressing her thumb into the wood. She did this for nearly 10 minutes before she spoke, toe-nailed corner bracing instead of proper tenons. She stood and brushed her hands together. Everything held until the lateral load from the snow came. That is why the wall fell away clean instead of collapsing inward on the animals. Bad framing fails in predictable directions. Calvin had come out with a second mug of coffee he had not known what to do with except bring. Lucky then. Physics. She took the coffee without looking at him. Before I frame the new wall, I'm going to pull these stumps and pour fresh footings. That adds 2 days to the schedule. I'm still saying 10 days total. How? First light to last light, and I do not waste motion. She produced a length of knotted string from her coat pocket and began marking footing positions on the frozen ground. When it comes time to walk the wall plate up, I will need your help. That is the only part of this job that requires 2 pairs of hands. Everything else I can manage. Calvin had planned to stand back and let her discover what she could not do, then intervene with some dignity maintained on both sides. He understood by the time she had the string out that no such rescue would be required or welcome. Teddy was a capable worker, not yet filled out the way he would be in 3 more years, still more rope than muscle, but consistent, and he took instruction without argument. He could read a tape measure, knew which end of a draw knife was which, and moved lumber without being directed to it. On the second afternoon, Nora showed Emmett how to mix mortar. She demonstrated the water to lime ratio, then showed him the test by feel, pressing a small portion between her fingers and describing what correct consistency felt like against what was too dry or too wet. She handed him the hoe and walked away to work on the footing stumps. When she came back 40 minutes later, she checked the batch, adjusted the water by a single small measure, and said, "Good." She moved on. Emmett said nothing. His shoulders, however, changed. The footings went in on the second day. The new posts were set and plumbed on the 4th. Calvin held the plumb bob while Nora drove the drift pins, and she was faster with a mallet than any man he had watched at the same work. She talked only to state requirements, hold the bob still, or sight down the outside face, or 3 inches toward you. When he got it right, she moved to the next post. She did not thank him in a way that implied the help had been a favor. On the 5th evening, she put Jess on her hip and walked the completed framing, running her free hand along each joint. Jess reached for the wood with both hands, curious. Nora let her feel it and explained the grain to the child by touch. Rough here, smoother here. This is how you know which way it will split. Jess understood none of this and held on and listened to her mother's voice the way children hold a thing that makes them safe. Emmett watched this from the barn door. He did not say anything. He went back to the house and set the table for supper. The pressure came from a direction Calvin had not told Nora about, and he would have preferred to keep it from her longer. But on the 5th day, Lloyd Hargrove rode out from town. Hargrove ran the feed store on Maple and had been angling at Calvin's northwest quarter section for 2 years. He was not a dishonest man, which was the thing that made it complicated. He arrived at the farmyard in the afternoon with a fair offer, 2 pages in a lawyer's hand, and presented it while Nora was still visible at the barn site on the scaffolding plank. His eyes went to her and stayed there a moment. Calvin watched him register the situation and decide not to comment on it. Hargrove laid it out plainly. The northwest quarter was good ground. He was offering fair market plus 10%. Calvin could use the proceeds to settle the note, clear the debt entirely, and still have enough left to make the spring with room. He would lose the quarter. He would keep the house and the working ground. Calvin took the papers. "I am aware of what I would lose." Hargrove turned his hat in his hands. "I am not trying to take something from you." He knew about the bank notice, which meant someone at the bank had talked, which was not surprising and was not Hargrove's fault, and Calvin held none of it against him. "I'm trying to give you a way through a bad position." Calvin told him he would think on it. Hargrove rode back to town and did not press because he was not that kind of man. That evening, after supper and after Teddy had gone to read and Jess was asleep on the trundle, Nora asked Calvin to show her the paperwork on the property. She said it simply, the way she might ask for the salt. He looked at her across the table. "I could see the corner of the bank's letter the morning you collected the mail. I recognized that letterhead. You have been carrying this since October." He brought the tin box from under the bed. He lifted the lid himself, which was easier than watching her do it. She took out all 3 letters from the bank and read them in order, holding each one level under the lamp. Her face did not change in the way that suggested pity, which he had been dreading. She set the last letter down. "They have issued a notice of accelerated maturity. They are calling the note before term." She turned the 3rd letter over and read the back. "However, there is a hardship clause in the original instrument. It allows the borrower to petition for an extension of up to 6 months, provided the request is in writing before the 15th of December, with documentation of the qualifying hardship. You have 18 days. Calvin was quiet. "I can write the letter." She had her hands flat on the table. "I can describe the barn damage, the stock at risk, the early frost that cut the yield, and cite the clause by section and paragraph. A bank like this one will grant the extension. They do not want the land. They want the note paid, and a farm they have forced into failure is worth less to them than a modified schedule with interest. You keep the northwest quarter. You keep all of it." She stacked the letters neatly and set them back in the box. "You will need to sign whatever I draft. I will read it aloud first, the whole of it, as slow as you need." He could not see his own face in that moment. He supposed it told her what she needed to know about why reading it aloud would matter. She met his eyes straight. "There's no shame in not having had the schooling. My husband did not either. He built finish work that is standing in 3 counties and will still be standing when men who can read every word of a bank letter have been forgotten entirely." She closed the lid of the tin box and pushed it toward him. "I will draft it tomorrow evening after the site work, when there is still lamplight left." She took the lamp and went to check on Jess. Calvin sat at the table in the near dark for a long time after she was gone. The letter went out on the 11th day, carried to the Delphos post office by Calvin's own hand. Nora had drafted it the previous evening in 2 versions and read both aloud. He chose the longer one. She read it again slowly, and he asked her to stop twice so he could think over a phrase, and she stopped without comment and waited, and when he said to go on, she went on. He signed it at the kitchen table with Emmett and Teddy both in the room, and neither boy said anything, and the quiet ordinariness of that, of 2 boys sitting at a table while a man signed a letter, was something Calvin thought about for some time afterward. The wall went up on the 8th day of framing. Calvin and Nora walked the plate beam into position together, one at each end, moving by count. She had him brace it while she drove the tree nails, hand-cut wooden pins, not iron, into the mortise joints at each post. The sound of the mallet changed when a joint was fully seated, shifting from hollow to solid, and she had told him to listen for it. Every time it changed, she said, "There," and moved to the next post. When the last pin was driven, she put her hand flat on the top plate and held it there. "It's right." He put his own hand beside hers on the plate. He could feel what she meant. No give anywhere it should not give. The frame receiving the pressure the way a good frame does, distributing it equally everywhere instead of concentrating anywhere. He had not known he would be able to feel the difference until he felt it. She sheathed the outside face on days 9 and 10, working from the scaffolding plank with Teddy feeding boards up from the ground. She cut the corner boards herself, fitting each one with a draw knife before nailing, so there was no gap and no pucker where the boards met the frame. She ran a bead of pine tar in every joint before the board went on, pushing it in with a finger, wiping the excess onto a rag she kept tucked in her belt. In the cold air, the smell of it came off sharp and clean, and the wood at the seams darkened to a color that would last as long as the wall itself, longer, probably, than anyone standing there that day. Emmett brought her a cup of water at mid-morning each day and set it on the scaffolding board without saying anything. She drank it without looking down. On the last day, he brought 2 cups and climbed up beside her and watched her fit the final corner board, and she let him hold the board in place while she drove the first nail. He held it square without being told. She drove the rest. On the 10th evening, she came in from outside and stood in the kitchen, and Calvin heard in the quality of her movement that the work was done. Not tired, exactly. Finished, which is a different thing. Emmett had been setting 4 bowls every morning since the 2nd day. He had also, Calvin had noticed without remarking on it, shifted his own chair to the other side of the table so that he sat beside Nora at breakfast, with Teddy across from them. The arrangement had simply happened, the way water finds its level, and no one had said anything about it. Jess had taken to reaching for Emmett's sleeve when she was lifted down from the stool, and Emmett steadied her with one hand without looking away from his food, the way a person does a thing that has already become ordinary to him. After supper on the 11th evening, Calvin set a folded document on the table. He had gone to Hennessy's law office on Front Street on the same day he posted the bank letter and had the amendment drawn up. He paid for it from the emergency tin above the stove, which now held 8 cents in a button. Nora unfolded it. She read it straight through, the way she read everything, and then she read the essential portion again. It was a deed amendment. It named her as co-owner in equal interest of the farm and all improvements. Calvin. If you want to say no, say no. He kept his gaze on the table. But the land is here, and you are here, and you have kept what I built from being lost, and the barn standing now is a better barn than the one I had, and I am not going to pretend that doesn't matter because I don't know how to say it in the proper way. She was quiet for a time. The lamp was burning low. You have not asked me anything. The deed is not a question. The question would come after, if you want to hear it. She studied the document for a long time. She folded her hands on top of it, the same gesture she had used considering the bank's letters, a woman who thought a thing from several sides before she arrived at it. I have 2 children I am responsible for. Jess is entirely mine, and Teddy will be on his own in 3 years, but until then, he is mine as well. They come with me. I know that. I am not a woman who does things halfway. I have noticed that. My husband's tools are in that crate in your barn. He built things that are still standing in 3 counties. I would want the tools used. Calvin let a moment pass before he answered. My barn would be the proof of it. I don't imagine anyone who sees that wall will have questions about the tools or the woman who used them. She left her hand on the document, not a signature yet, a woman taking the full measure of the ground under her feet before she put her weight on it. She picked up the pencil from the table and signed her name below the deed line. All right. The deed was recorded at the county register on the 1st of December, 18 days before the bank's deadline. The clerk wrote the names together on one line, and the conjunction between them was a small word that covered considerable territory. The bank granted the extension on the 14th of December. 6 months, modified schedule, exactly as Nora had said they would. The northwest quarter stayed on the deed, beside her name and Calvin's. It was Emmett who had understood first. Not the way adults understand things, with argument and the long wait of what might go wrong. The way a child understands, directly and well before the adults, and with no need of confirmation from anyone. He had set the 4th bowl on the morning of the 2nd day. He had moved his chair on the 3rd. In the 1st week, he had taken Jess to the corral fence every morning after breakfast, held her on his hip, and named each horse to her one by one, pointing. She said back whatever she could manage of each name. Emmett said, close enough, each time, and moved to the next, and within a week, this had become the shape of every morning. On the evening of the 1st of December, after supper and before bed, Emmett went to the shelf where the family Bible was kept. His mother's name was written on the first page in her own hand, Ellen Pruitt. Below it, in the careful block letters of a boy who had learned to read largely on his own and taken the work seriously, was his own, Emmett Calvin Pruitt. He stood at the shelf a while with a pencil. Then he added 2 names below his own in the same block letters, with the same care. He set the pencil on the shelf and went to bed without saying anything about what he had done. Nora found the Bible the next morning, reaching for it to check a date on a land document. She stood at the shelf for a long time. The names were there in Emmett's hand, clear and unhurried, as if he had done nothing more consequential than record a fact that was already settled. Jess broke the silence. She was standing at Emmett's knee with both hands wrapped around his forearm, which was her established position in the mornings now. She said, "Mama," not pointing at anyone. 2 years old, saying the word that named warmth and safety and the place you belonged when you belonged somewhere, directed at the room at large and at the morning and at the particular kitchen she had been waking up in for nearly 2 weeks. Emmett looked over at Nora. He was 8 years old, and he had the expression of someone who has known the correct answer for some time and is not surprised to see it arrive. She says that when she's in a place she likes. He turned back to his breakfast. Nora sat down. Calvin came in from outside and set the coffee on the stove, and the sound of it, the plain sound of a man making coffee in his own kitchen on an ordinary December morning, was the sound the room had been missing for a year and a half and would not be missing again. The barn stood through every winter for 4 decades and more. Travelers on the road from Salina sometimes pulled up to look at the corner joints, which were a kind of finish work rarely seen on a farm building in that part of Kansas, tight and square and somewhat more precise than strictly necessary. This was a quality of Nora Pruitt's work that people in the county came to know her by. She did not stop at adequate when better was within reach, and the barn was the first proof of it visible from the road. Emmett grew up and left and came back, which is the kind of leaving that counts for something. Jess learned to use a draw knife before she learned to bake bread, which suited her and troubled no one. On winter mornings, long past the years of difficulty, the stove was going before Calvin came downstairs because Nora rose first. He never asked her to. It was simply how the mornings had arranged themselves, the particular shape the days took after enough of them had passed in the same house together.